Hello and welcome. I'm Janine Hill, health practitioner, healer, spiritual seeker, mother, lover, and entrepreneur. My podcasts are designed with the intent to educate, inspire, empower, and cover all things heartfelt, soulful, and current. Today we have a special guest, Chris Yusuf from the UK, who's here to talk all things astrology. Now, you may remember, listeners, that Chris was able to do a podcast for us at the start of the year, and we discussed the placements of planets for 2021 and how that was going to not only impact us globally, but on a personal level as well. So Chris is here today to chat a little bit more with us about 6 months on and what's coming up in particular on the 28th of July, which is a transit with Jupiter moving into Aquarius. Hey Chris, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you going?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. How are the things in the UK at the moment?
Things are good. Weather's heating up, but it's a bit rainy here today, and it will be for the week. But yeah, it's been good.
Great to hear. So, talk to us about Jupiter. What's going on with Jupiter on July the 28th?
So on July 28th, Jupiter goes back into Aquarius, and for the last 2.5 months or so, since May 15, it's been in Pisces. It kind of pushed ahead into Pisces, but now it's going back into Aquarius until the end of the year. So that's the major happening with Jupiter for this year.
What does it mean when, just for the listeners, when a planet, well, not a planet, but when a planet goes back into a sign, so you're saying that it was in Pisces from May to July 28 or 27, and then it's going back into Aquarius. What does that mean?
So traditionally, whenever a retrograde occurs, so basically a retrograde is a planet moving backwards.
Okay.
But obviously planets don't go backwards. It's from our perspective on Earth, they go backwards, because we're moving a lot faster and whatnot, at least according to Jupiter. But basically, a retrograde is a period of the re-affix. So what that means is, a reassessment, a re-examination, a rewind. Anything starting with a re-affix is kind of what a retrograde is. Normally, people are familiar with the Mercury retrogrades, and people are often, Mercury's to do with communication, so people think communication will go haywire and whatnot, and sometimes that does happen. But the deeper message of a retrograde is a introspection. I found it's a re-examination internally. A lot of people can associate retrogrades with running with the shoelaces out, but to me it's more of an introspection. It's more of a stepping back a bit and saying what's happening, and just examining the situation, slowing down.
So with that in mind, what is it that we need to revisit, review with Jupiter going back into Aquarius? I suppose the first thing really ahead of all of that for the listeners, what is the planet Jupiter about, and how does that show up in people's charts or in their lives?
Jupiter is it's a benefic planet, which means it's a beneficial planet. It's like a good, so to speak, planet. And you've got to think, in Greek mythology, Jupiter is Zeus. It's very it's the god of the gods, so to speak. Where it is in your chart tends to indicate expansion, where you go to expand. It's also, to me, where I think you have a lot of luck or things come easy. And that's a really interesting placement. So, for example, if you've got Jupiter in Gemini, you might have a bit of a gift of the gab. If you've got Jupiter in Sagittarius, which is its natural placement, you might be good at sports or good at physical activity. It's that type of thing, just to put it really plainly and simply. But Jupiter it's first and foremost an expansive sign. It's about expanding things. It's about a deeper purpose. It's about luck, so to speak. And with things like expansion come other things like travel and education, and those fields. So to me, Jupiter is all things plentiful. But obviously there's a flip side to that, having an overabundance of something, or going a bit over the top. Jupiter does have that effect as well.
Yeah, Mark Lawrenson of the astrologer and Sydney Astrology School, I've heard mention with Jupiter, the flip side can also be about a bit of like denial, or not always, not seeing the wood through the trees, if that's the right expression.
Yeah. Jupiter, I guess, like the god, has a bit of irresponsibility to it. It tends to be all about the good times. I mean, it's probably why Saturn, which is the sign, the planet after, kind of has to rein things in with its restrictions and with its limitations and obstacles, just to kind of, make sure we're still being a bit more responsible, I guess.
Yeah, not that we globally know anything about restriction at the moment.
No, not at all.
So
Sorry,
with
go on.
Jupiter, no, you're right. With Jupiter going into Aquarius on the 28th, and interestingly enough for the listeners, we've also got Saturn in Aquarius at the moment too. Is it until? Just remind me. When's that until?
They're kind of the Saturn in Aquarius, you mean? What is that?
Yeah. When's that?
Well, Saturn tends to spend about 2.5 or so years in each sign. So it entered last December, so it could probably carry on until about 2022, 2023. Don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere around that time. I would say that Saturn is going to be in Aquarius, but Jupiter and Saturn right now have been playing a game of cat and mouse. They've been kind of at each other's tails for a while. There. And if you remember in the talk that we had at the beginning of the year, we did mention this period. So I had mentioned a few periods this year, and a lot of them were to do with Aquarian themes. And Jupiter was mentioned. So I was saying that at May 15th till late July, now it's July 28th, as we know, Jupiter was going to be in Pisces. And I remember in that talk mentioning that it was going to be a bit of an oasis time, where, there would be potentially a false sense of optimism, and travel would potentially open up, and whatnot. Actually, I'm not sure if I mentioned the false optimism, but that's generally the impression that I've gotten now, having experienced it. But it was supposed to be a period where things would kind of lax a bit. But you have to remember that Jupiter went into retrograde with Pisces around about a few weeks ago. So even though we kind of went into Pisces, it was kind of going back through Pisces the way it came and back into Aquarius now. And here in the UK, around about when Jupiter went into Pisces, a lot of our restrictions here started to get a bit more lax, and we started to let go of a lot of the restrictions here. And I saw the same in Europe and in the US and the rest of the world. There was kind of a move towards leaving restrictions as Jupiter went into Pisces.
look, and you can say the same for us here in Australia, and in particular in Sydney. It was almost like, uh, we're coming back,
Yeah.
and not the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could say there was a reassessment of the risk.
Indeed. Yeah.
And maybe things were a bit too lax, and maybe Jupiter's influence was a bit too, whatever, let's just enjoy ourselves. Let's let go of those responsibilities a bit more as it went into Pisces. Because I remember in late June when the New South Wales budget was being released, for example, things were looking a bit more optimistic in Sydney, but that all really took a really sharp turn straight after that. Just as the retrograde was occurring, not that we could associate all that with that, but it's interesting seeing those parallels where there was a reassessment. We went from a period of over optimism to a period of, hold on, let's reassess things, let's go back.
Absolutely. Yes. So with all of that in mind, now that Jupiter is retrograding and moving into the sign of Aquarius, what, from your perspective as an astrologer, do you see happening over the next 6 months while this transit is
It's
in
happening.
our midst?
So so Jupiter first went into Aquarius December of 21 last year. And what I noticed from then, so I always had the suspicion that when Jupiter went into Aquarius, as it did with Saturn as well, they were there, they had a conjunction at that time as well, that Aquarian themes would obviously pop through a lot more. And as we discussed in your last podcast, the themes of Aquarius tend to be things like activism, rebellion, progression, technology, decentralization. And we've seen a lot of those themes come through. In America, we had the Capitol riots, or the insurrection. At the end of January, we had a square with Uranus, not to get too complicated, but that issue with Uranus and Taurus, we had that rebellion with the stock market, where people were taking back control over it and saying, no, hold on, we're not going to be at the mercy of bankers. Let's try and manipulate the stock market ourselves. So with the GameStop stocks as well. So we saw a decentralization happen and a rebellion, and it was done over technology. So all those Aquarian themes were happening. And in fact, last year in 2020, on April the 1st to late June, Jupiter went into Aquarius again. And that's when we saw some other rebellions as well. We had the first signs of rebellion against COVID restrictions, and we had the first rebellion against police brutality in America, so Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
And that's when Jupiter first went into Aquarius then. It had the same retrograde we had this year with Pisces was happening last year during that period, April to June-ish of 2020. So I am noticing a lot more of those themes that will occur, and I think it's gearing up now. You've got the protests in Sydney. I think they're going to increase, all those rebellions, all those protests and whatnot. It really has been a year of fighting the power and fighting the establishment, which Aquarius is known for.
Yes, and it's also known for its humanitarian stance. And so despite there being this divide that we're witnessing here in Sydney, but in other parts of the world, and that's the thing that you and I were having a conversation the other day just in regards to how, from an Australian culture perspective, whenever there's crisis, we shine in the sense of all coming together. And this is a very new, if you like, phenomenon where there is this divide. And so yet my understanding of the Aquarian vibration, which you talked about, decentralization, is also that sense of, from the humanitarian perspective, everyone is equal and no one is above anyone else, and it's about that, not a hierarchical way of existing. It's very much a what's the word I'm looking for, collaborative approach with that energy. So I suppose where we're at the moment here, in particular in Sydney on this particular day, my hope for that expansion with Jupiter is also going to have that real humanitarian flavor of working all together in a unified way. And I suppose that is achievable once there's it's like the rebellion, the contrast can potentially create that is my hope.
I hope so as well. I hope, so far we're seeing a lot more division. But at the same
Yes.
time, I do have to wonder, I do read some studies that say that we're actually a lot less divisive than we have been, and we're a lot more exposed to other opinions than at any time in history. In the past, people were a lot more, not just closed-minded, but wouldn't have the opportunity to see somebody else's perspective. Whereas these days we are. And I'm hoping that leads to less division. But there is still quite a lot of division that I've seen and that we see on the news. Whether or not that's the case or not, in reality, is another story. But it would be nice for those Aquarian themes of humanitarianism, of caring about your fellow man or woman to come through. Hopefully, with this transit, you've got to remember that we've got things at odd with Aquarius as well. Even though we've got Jupiter in Aquarius and Saturn in Aquarius, you have other placements that are squaring or antagonizing these placements, and I'm sure we're going to have another square soon. But yeah, hopefully this all leads to greater camaraderie and humanitarianism.
Yes.
My main prediction is that there will be more of a
here's the ambulance right when we're talking about
less drama. Exactly. Hopefully there's less of that. There's
love
always
it,
ambulances going on. But yeah, I mean, separate from the rebellion stuff, what we will see is, also greater technological use, more science-based efforts, and hopefully more decentralization and greater care and compassion.
So with the two social planets, as we'll call them, with the Jupiter and the Saturn, both coming into Aquarius, be interesting. I'm not aware of the degree between them to see how strong the conjunction is actually going to be.
I
But
think
it's going to be interesting to see that Saturnian restriction and limitations that Saturn does impose from the point of view to create a sense of mastery. And then we've also got Aquarius in Jupiter, which is about the expansion. And, I'm also aware that Jupiter is also very much about, the sense of the beliefs and the faith and religion, and all of those energies are part of the Jupiter story, aren't they?
absolutely, yeah. There's a spirituality element to Jupiter as well, and that will play a part. What I've kind of just picked up now is that Saturn is in its domicile in Aquarius. So what that means is that Saturn's it likes being in Aquarius. I'm not sure Jupiter's a bit ambivalent about being in Aquarius, but Saturn is, you know, kind of a bit stronger here because it's in its natural place. So I do wonder if there are going to be, if there is going to be an emphasis on spirituality, but at the same time, there may be restrictions on Jupiter as a result. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well. But there will be a conjunction. There will have to be a conjunction, which is a Jupiter and Saturn combining in the next few months, as well as Jupiter bypasses Saturn sometime soon before it switches into Pisces in December. So what the last 2.5 months have been a preview of what we're going to get from December 28 onwards. Just like last year was a bit of a preview for this year. In terms of
a sense of easing, isn't it? As you were talking about,
yeah,
that isn't it interesting now? And I can't definitely say this is 100% correct. However, looking at a news report today, there was talk of, and again, is it actually a perception? Is it legit? Well, I can't confirm that, but there was, just tying in with this conversation, there was something that was said about restrictions in Sydney could potentially go on until December, all right, Christmas. And interestingly enough, having this conversation today, hearing about Aquarius in Jupiter until December, I don't know the date to hand.
December 28, yeah.
It that fascinates me, and also the fact that we've got Saturn, our beautiful restrictor, to help us master through through discipline and commitment and hard work. Yeah. It's all very interesting how relevant and relative that seems to be playing itself out, or will potentially play itself out.
I would agree. I think here in Europe we may see a some more restrictions coming back into play potentially. Maybe not, but there may be a rethinking of them. At the beginning of next month, perhaps. But yeah, I would see, December 28 as being a period where perhaps things really start to lift off from there, just as they had for us in Europe, when Jupiter went into Pisces. The other aspect to this, and something else that's just popped up into my head, is that, if we're getting a lot of Aquarian themes, and what I'm noticing is, Aquarius is the sign of the group. It's the sign of the community. And I think what can really help people in this manner is forming communities. Now, obviously, we're restricted right now, but Aquarius is also the sign of the internet. Forming online communities and groups may also help during this period. It may be a blessing. Jupiter may be saying, let's kind of go down that path of let's form communities, because that really helps people. I often say to people, going for a walk during lockdowns helps clear your mind, but connecting with people on a social level is also a great mood lifter as well. Not that I need to tell people that, but it's good to remind during this period that it might be, handy to do that at this time. The flavor favors it.
Very much so. And in response to that, that's the main driver that guided me to create an astrology circle for people to come together and just to be able to provide information like this, so that it's not necessarily, yes, it is information that you can learn about and hear, that you can apply to your daily life, but it, in a sense, it takes us out of our daily life for a moment to realize that from a humanitarian Aquarian perspective, we are actually all in this. We're in it in different ways, and we're all being impacted uniquely, but also across the board too. And that's why, like you're saying, what's really going to help us all individually is know that collectively we can come together. And even though we may have these restrictive physical limitations, we're not restricted with the technology, because Aquarius is the airwaves, right? So you know, it's an air sign. So for the audience, or the listeners, it's an air sign, which is all about communication. It's all about rational thinking. It's all about social energies and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
people, you are not alone.
No, and I think also, just to add to that, is, you know, as a Capricorn, I like to see the benefit, you know, making good use out of bad times. And you know, Jupiter is the sign of education.
Yes.
You know, and Aquarius is technology. You know, like myself, I've looked into studying computer science, which is taking it a bit too literally. But
How ironic.
how ironic.
Not.
But I think the point I'm trying to make is, you know, technology is going to be a big part of our lives, whether we like it or not, and we can use it to our benefit. I think it's a good period for people and your listeners to perhaps, you know, sharpen their tech skills or computer skills or virtual skills or whatever it may be. You know, it may be a period for that, to develop and, you know, find a higher understanding of that. It'd be perfect
Yes.
use of the time, I would say.
Yes, and I agree with you, and I think it's also really important that people understand too that it's really valuable to remember, as what we've been sharing for the last few minutes, being in a group scenario. So,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
technology can be isolating to a degree.
yes,
Um,
yes,
and also and then also the too much technology. So, you
yes,
know, it's this balancing of that humanitarian energy um, with the technology. The other side of it too is Aquarius energy knows how to have a really good time. You know, Aquarius is the traditionally, like, correct me if I'm wrong, the hippie energy, you
yeah,
know, the healer. Like, I know other astrologers have discussed with you know, the emphasis on this Aquarian energy that we're experiencing and coming into that Aquarian age. You know, there are going to be um, energies and opportunities that have never been here before, because it's coming from like a higher octave. So
yeah,
it's like tapping in on those higher energies. And it's
yeah,
that balance of the spiritual, which is Jupiter too, and
yeah,
the technology. So, but it's also really important, people, grounding yourself during this
yes,
time too, you know.
yes, yes. I mean, look, I always equate, as you know, I always equate Aquarius with the hippie slash activist and the scientist archetype. Um,
Mm.
and that activist does fight for things. And what I'm noticing as well with my clients that I work with, is that there is a push towards humanitarian pursuits. Like, they want to do business ventures that have a positive social good. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of this as well. Um, and I think that's a lovely benefit of the Aquarian energy, to have that. And also, what you're doing is broadcasting as well. Even though we mentioned it before, Aquarius is a sign of broadcasting, and you're expanding out into that area, which is great. Um, but yeah, to me, I really like the whole let's go down the social route. Let's worry less about material things and about caring for one another, which is very Aquarian in its hippie-like nature. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, Chris, before we close, is there anything else that you think might benefit the listeners for this next 6 months with Jupiter in Aquarius? I think another thing too is there's there's a lightness, because air is obviously light. There is a lightness to this. So even though there is the activism and the the reform and that side of the equation, but there's also I mean, it makes me think of Woodstock back in the
Yeah.
60s, right? When that was the heyday, and the hey man, and let's have a great time, and the balance, of course, as a Libra, and I'm always concerned with the balance. So that balancing those energies so that there is just more equilibrium.
Yeah, what we talked about at the beginning of the podcast was balancing out the Aquarian energy, which is very online, which is very virtual, with a more natural approach.
Yes.
You know, going out into nature and you know, still going outside when you can. That to me is a great positive. But Aquarius, in and of itself, is also a great opportunity to kind of grow and have a wider perspective and get that bigger picture about things. And you can really use that to your advantage with what you do, with your learning, with your consciousness, with your spirituality, just to help
Yes.
grow that. But you know, don't forget the other aspects, which are the squares. You know, connecting with people on deep levels, and
Yes.
connecting with nature and the world. I mean, and you know, the natural world, so to speak.
Very, very well said. Yeah, thank you. So, if any of the listeners have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we are more than happy to support you and answer anything that you're needing some clarification around. And we'll definitely be getting Chris back to talk about some other astrological topics that are really going to be of benefit to you. Before we finish up, I just also wanted to say, Chris, if you can expand on this, note that for those listeners that have had their natal birth chart done, and they've had readings and interpretations done and have an understanding of their chart, please note that any other planets in your chart that have Aquarius in them will also be activated during this time. Chris, do you want to expand on that for a little bit?
Yeah.
If you feel it's
Yeah, of
relevant.
course. So, I mean, Aquarius, if you have Aquarius in your chart, as well as any fixed signs, to be honest, as well.
And what are
So,
they?
so that'll be your Taurus, your Leo, your Scorpio. If you've got any of those in your natal chart, depending on the degree, they will be affected by the transit. So, you know, if you've got Venus in Aquarius, like myself, maybe, you know, relating, you know, will be, you know, there'll be an overabundance of relating. So maybe there'll be more social pursuits, you know, more people want to be social. If you've got Mercury in Scorpio, you may find that your mind, you know, Mercury's communication, that your mind may be, you know, focused on a big picture, and you know, you want to expand yourself, or you
Oh,
know,
that's
or
good
whatnot.
because my
But
Mercury's in Scorpio.
I know, funny that.
Funny that. Oh, good. Big
Funny that I
picture
chose that one.
expansion. Love it.
But yeah,
Yeah. No,
it'll depend on the planet that you've, you know, that you've got a fixed sign in, as to what
yes.
will be occurring, and obviously the exact degree. But that's, you know, that's when an astrologer can help you out with that, help you understand that on a deeper level. There's so many combinations that it's hard to.
Sure. Yes, understand completely. That's great. Chris, thank you so much for your time and your insight and your predictions and interpretations. I have absolutely no doubt that everyone that's listened is going to pick up some really valuable points. And please, listeners, do let us know. Let us know what you're finding interesting, what you'd like to hear more about, because we really are here to serve and help as a community. Because you know, Chris and I have been really involved in the astrology. Chris much longer than I have, in the astrology world, and we know how beneficial it can be when you're really applying it and you're really working with your chart and understanding yourself, because it really can be used as a tool for your evolution. And we are in a really phenomenal time, and make the most of it. And if astrology is a tool that you can really use to activate and access your opportunities at a deeper level, absolutely go for it. And we are totally here
Yeah.
to serve you in your pursuits, very much so.
Yeah, I would agree.
Great. Chris, thank you so much for your time, and we and I look really forward to our next podcast.
Anytime. Great to chat.
Thanks again.
No worries. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.